The night before my wedding, I found my name carved into a basement wall inside the Vale estate. Below it was a date, 3 days in the future. That was the exact day I was supposed to disappear. At first, I tried to convince myself it was a sick prank by Elias's family to scare a new bride. But when I brought Elias down to the basement and pointed at the wall, the colour completely drained from his face. He didn't look angry, he looked terrified. Then he grabbed my arm and whispered, "Mara, you were never supposed to find this room." I met Elias Vale 6 months ago at an old bookstore during a violent thunderstorm. He was quiet, well-spoken, and carried the unmistakable air of old money. His family owned a sprawling 19th century estate outside the city, hidden deep behind black pine trees and an ancient rusted iron fence. But the very first day I stepped inside, something felt deeply wrong. The long mahogany hallways didn't have family photos. Instead, they were lined with oil paintings of young women in vintage wedding dresses, and every single one of their faces had been violently scratched out of the canvas. The morning after our wedding, Elias's mother, Margaret, met me in the dining hall. She sat perfectly straight, her eyes a milky pale grey, holding a heavy silver key on a velvet ribbon. Without smiling, she handed it to me and said her voice never rose above a whisper. "This house has stood for 2 centuries, Mara. It survives because we follow 3 rules. First, never enter the East Wing after midnight. Second, never ask about the brides who came before you. And third, under no circumstances do you ever remove your wedding ring while inside these walls." I tried to laugh it off, assuming it was some eccentric aristocratic tradition. But that very night, I woke up at precisely 12:17 a.m. The air in our bedroom was freezing. Outside our heavy oak door, someone was softly weeping. A woman's muffled voice whispered through the keyhole. "Mara?" I reached across the silk sheets for Elias, but his side of the bed was cold and empty. Then came 3 slow, heavy knocks against the wood. When I opened the door a minute later, the hallway was empty, but wet, muddy footprints stretched from our bedroom straight toward the restricted East Wing. The next morning, Elias insisted he had been down in the kitchen all night, but the kitchen was on the opposite side of the house. He couldn't explain the mud on the floor. Driven by suspicion, I waited until dusk and followed the corridor to the end of the East Wing. There stood a massive iron-reinforced door with no handle, only a single keyhole shaped precisely like a wedding band. The moment my fingers brushed the cold metal, a voice sobbed from the dark space behind it. "Oh, please, help me. Clara!" That night, while the entire estate slept under a suffocating silence, I searched the house for answers. In the dark library, behind a loose, moss-covered brick near the cold fireplace, my fingers brushed against leather. It was a small, dusty diary with silver clasps. On the very first page, written in shaky, frantic handwriting, was a single sentence. "The family does not mourn its brides. It replaces them." The diary belonged to Clara Vale, a bride who had married into the family 40 years earlier. At first, her entries described ordinary things, wedding gifts, awkward dinners, and strange arguments with her mother-in-law. But then the handwriting spiraled into madness. She wrote about hearing heavy footsteps beneath the floorboards. She wrote about a woman singing dark lullabies inside the walls. And she wrote about her wedding ring, stating that every night at midnight, the metal grew colder, burning her skin like ice. At the bottom was a cavernous stone chamber. Cold water dripped from the ceiling. On the far wall, carved into the ancient rock, was a list of names. Clara Vale, Rebecca Vale, Helen Vale, Margaret Vale. Each name had a date carved beneath it. Next to the wall stood weathered wooden boxes, holding dusty, yellowed wedding dresses. Some were stained dark brown. Others were caked in dry grave dirt. And there, my heart stopped. At the very bottom of the wall, fresh dust still clinging to the cuts, was my own name, Mara Vale. Underneath it was a date, 3 days from tonight. Instantly, my wedding ring violently tightened around my finger, crushing the bone. I pulled at it, but it wouldn't budge. That's when I felt heavy, warm breathing on the back of my neck. I spun around, but no one was there. And with a deafening crash, the heavy basement door slammed shut. 10 minutes later, the heavy door slowly creaked open. Elias stood at the top of the stairs holding a flickering brass lantern. I rushed to him, crying, demanding to know why my name was carved into the rock. For a long time, he just stared at me with hollow eyes. Then he whispered that his family had been hiding a dark secret for generations. He claimed every bride had vanished shortly after finding the basement, and that his mother, Margaret, was obsessed with a curse. He grabbed my hands and swore, "I married you to protect you, Mara. We have to leave right now, before sunrise." For a moment, I actually believed him. We agreed to escape at dawn. But when I woke up an hour later, Elias was gone and the basement door was left wide open. Driven by panic, I crept back down into the dark. Deep behind the name-carved wall, a hidden passage had opened. I followed the haunting sound of rhythmic chanting into a vast subterranean chamber. Dozens of black candles circled a blood-red altar. In the center stood Mother Margaret, holding a heavy leather-bound book, reciting incantations in an ancient, dead language. As I stepped back in horror, a shadow moved from behind the altar. It was Elias! He wasn't trapped. He wasn't trying to save me. He was standing beside his mother, wearing a cold, sinister smile. Tears welled in my eyes as I whispered, "You lied to me." Elias looked at me without an ounce of regret and said, "I didn't lie, Mara. I just protected you from the truth until the ceremony was ready. The family doesn't bury its brides because of a curse. We bury them to create the curse." Margaret turned the pages of the black book. On the very last page, written in fresh, wet ink, was my name. Elias stepped closer, his voice smooth and terrifying. "Every bride who wears the silver ring becomes bound to this house. Their spirits feed the family's wealth and power, and every son of the Vale line becomes the keeper of the dead. Today, I become the keeper, and you, Mara, become eternal." Panic took over. I turned and sprinted back up the stairs, slamming doors behind me. I ran down the main hallway toward the front entrance, but every door I opened didn't lead outside. It led right back into the same room. The library, the dining hall, the bedroom. Every path looped back to the basement. The house was changing. The walls were pulsing like breathing lungs, and the scratched wedding portraits in the hallway were no longer blank. The faces had returned, and all of them were watching me scream. I fell to my knees in the endless corridor, crying out in despair. That's when the temperature plunged below freezing. At the end of the hallway stood Clara Vale. Her vintage wedding dress was covered in grave dirt, but her eyes were clear and filled with pity. She pointed at my tightening wedding ring and whispered, The rings hold us here, Mara. Each ring carries the soul of the bride who wore it. You must pull it off before the midnight bell, or your soul will be chained to these walls forever. With a scream of sheer willpower, I grabbed my wedding ring and yanked it with all my strength. Skin tore, blood dripped onto the floorboards, but the silver band finally slipped off. The entire house shrieked like a dying monster. Clara gestured toward the library fireplace. Resting on the stone mantelpiece were 6 silver rings, the souls of every missing bride. I grabbed all 6 cold metal bands and hurled them directly into the roaring flames. The fire instantly exploded into a blinding, spectral blue flame. Mother Margaret shrieked as the grimoire in her hands burst into ash. Elias lunged toward me, his face twisted in rage. But before he could reach me, the floorboards buckled and cracked open. Decayed, dirt-caked hands reached up from the dark void beneath the house. 1 hand, then 5, then dozens. The spirits of the buried brides grabbed Elias by his legs, dragging him down into the earth. He screamed my name, begging for mercy, as the dark soil swallowed him whole. I sprinted through the front doors just as the massive glass windows shattered into thousands of pieces. I collapsed onto the cold, wet grass outside. Behind me, the entire Vale estate imploded into dust and smoke, disappearing into thin air as if it had never existed. When the police arrived an hour later, they found only an empty forest. No basement, no mansion, no evidence that the Vale family ever lived there. The officers believed I suffered a severe mental breakdown. For weeks, I tried to convince myself it was all a bad dream. Until yesterday morning, I opened my kitchen cabinet in my new apartment. And there stood the old wedding portrait, but the faces were no longer scratched out. Clara, Rebecca, Helen, all of them were staring directly at me, smiling. And right beside them stood a new figure, Elias Vale. Written beneath his name was a date. 3 days from now, last night I woke up at 12:17 a.m. outside my bedroom door. 3 slow knocks echoed, and a voice whispered, "Mara." I escaped the family that buried its brides. But the house followed me home,